All right, students, here we are at the beginning of week 6. So as is usual, I've created in Canvas a agenda for the week. And what I'll do is go through and talk about some of these items on that agenda. So the first thing I want to do is talk about the responses to your responses to the question about the impact of McLuhan-Fiore. And then I'll talk a little bit about you talking about your visual autobiographies. Then I'll talk briefly about the results of the quiz on laws of the letter. And then visual design project number 2, some initial responses. So some of you have already submitted it. I've looked at them and I'm quite pleased and entertained by your efforts. And we'll get one more dose of unpacking Roland Barthes' The Rhetoric of the Image, and then talk about the readings that we have in store for beginning of next week, which would be March 7th. So, your thoughts on Goodhart versus McLuhan-Fiore. It was about 60-40. About 60% of the responses said no. Lupton and Miller are mistaken when they say that there has been little impact by McLuhan-Fiore. And then about 40% of the responses were, no, that's pretty much true. The Goodhart plain vanilla, old school, almost 1950s notion of layout and design are definitely the ones dominant. So what it really came down to is what kind of print media you're looking at. Some fashion magazines are much more avant-garde than others. Some news magazines might be much more traditional than others. And then the other possibility is that Lupton and Miller, when they were writing design writing research, which is now almost 20 years old, they might have seen little impact by McLuhan-Fiore, and maybe now it's just coming to blossom. Because one of the things I mentioned before, and we'll talk about it again when we visit McLuhan directly, is that he was tremendously influential in the 60s and 70s, and then sort of fell not into sort of disrepair, but skepticism about what he had to say was widespread, particularly in academic settings, until his projections, many of them sort of seemed to turn out to become true. So now there is a renewed interest in the work of Marshall McLuhan. So it was interesting to read your thoughts on what Lupton and Miller said about the impact of McLuhan and Fiore. And the next thing is a response to your talking about your visual autobiographies. So I enjoyed those. I enjoyed the variety of tools you used for your visual autobiographies, and then also the variety of tools that you used to record some audio about it. For the most part, they were pretty successful. There's one, I can't remember which student it is yet, but there's one that recorded some nice videos that she put into the slides, but then it turns out these are sort of Google Docs to which she needs to give permission to the rest of us to view them. So I clicked on it and it says you need to request permission, but I've yet to get request permission. But it's possible also that the setting on those videos could have been just public, in which case then people clicked on them wouldn't need permission. So that has yet to be resolved. And one of the things that I noticed about the visual autobiographies, there was one, I think Megan used a tool called Canva. I originally thought it was PictoChart because it looked a lot like a PictoChart. And one of the nice things about PictoChart and Canva is that they have sort of the what the designer Robin Williams calls the CRAP principles: contrast, repetition, alignment, and proximity. So those principles are baked into a template. So you pick one of those templates, and right off the bat, there's pretty good contrast. There's repetition. If it's a multiple slide thing, certain features on one slide are repeated in the next slide. And if it's not a multiple slide thing, but more like one poster thing, then there's a repetition of some other kinds of elements. And then the alignment is often, sort of like very nice. One of the things about if you use PowerPoint, sort of just blank PowerPoints and put in images and pictures, one of the rules of design is that everything needs to be aligned with something. And so having everything left aligned is not a good idea. Having everything center aligned is not a good idea. But basically blocks of text and the edges of images should be aligned with each other. The absence of alignment is something that viewers find sort of displeasing. both PowerPoint and Canva and Pictochart have the craft principles baked into their templates. And result then is if you use one of those templates, there's a good chance that you're going to have sort of some good design principles built into your product. All right. You were last week to read or to view a PBS video about American photography, and it was the second of a three-part series. So we skipped the first part because the first part is in the early days. There's some interesting things going on there, including the rise of photography right at the time of the Civil War. But it starts in the 30s, and it talks about the use of photography by the government for basically propaganda purposes. But I put in a Canvas page some of the things that I pulled out of that, viewing that video, that seemed like big issues. One was that photography has a selective nature. And when we talk in Bart's Rhetoric of the Image, he talks about, yes, you as a photographer can select lighting and focus and distance and framing, etc., but you cannot select for some things to be in the picture and not in the picture that are once in the frame. Whereas in drawing, you can do that. So that's a difference in terms of the degree of selectivity of photography. One of the commentators in the video said, seeing is believing, and the photograph is the most accurate way to see. And that could very well have been true from the 30s up until the 60s when that part 2 ends. But now, thanks to Photoshop, and you probably have a first-hand experience it now with you making believable yet impossible self-portraits, the notion that the photograph is the most accurate way to see is something that is probably undergoing radical revision because of technologies. Someone in the video said people want to see pictures of horrible things. And so that gets back to the notion of journalistic images and the notion of if it bleeds, it leads. So indeed, the mainstream news seems to have a disproportionate emphasis on plane crashes, terrorist attacks, wars, mayhem, floods, tornadoes, etc. So this is it's a fact of journalism that was mentioned in that video. So then, photography radically changed the way Americans experienced World War II. And so previous to this, people's experience of the war, previous wars might have been they could see a newspaper and there might be one picture somewhere in it about some event. Suddenly, at the time of World War II, people are getting Life magazine, they're getting Look magazine, and they're getting regular photo essays of some of the things going, including some of the horrific carnage involved in the Holocaust. Then when they get into the post-war period, someone says post-war fashion photography created a way we wanted to look, particularly about women. So the idea that photography now is creating norms. How should American women look? They should look the way they looked in the magazines like Look and Life magazine. But the magazines of the 50s created a very clear, narrow, tightly defined vision of what it is to be normal. So in the mid-50s, a new generation of photographers led by Robert Frank and William Klein replaced the ideal images of the 50s with more real pictures of American life. So photography is now moving from sort of documentation of an ideal American life to documentation of a real American life. And then once we get into the 60s, what we have, every aspect of American life was going through profound changes. And so the way the camera documented the civil rights movement and some of the horrible treatments of civil rights protesters, and then the Vietnam War, protests in the Vietnam War. So what happens is we've got a big change from when photography is first interested into American mainstream in the 30s to when it becomes sort of a documentation of some radical social change in the 60s. So that I thought was an important piece for us to have before we kind of really get into now the way photography is used in advertising images, etc. So in this week's module, I also have something that was this sort of notorious episode in 1994 when O.J. Simpson was on trial for having murdered his wife and her boyfriend. Time Magazine and Newsweek both published his mugshot, but Time Magazine basically had doctored the image in a way that made it look much darker. And so then this became a very controversial event in terms of the way news media could alter a photo in order to influence your perception and your attitudes towards the subject in the photo. The next thing in this module is pointing to someone who was mentioned in the law of the letters. But before I go to that, let me talk about the quiz results on the law of the letters. Most of you did quite well. The one or two questions that people didn't get right had to do with the actual effect of structuralist linguistics. And so one of the things that structuralism, we were first introduced to it early on when we looked at Ferdinand de Saussure and Charles Peirce. And structuralism works on a system of sort of opposition. So if we go back to language issues, we have the difference between a voiced and an unvoiced sound. So s, my vocal cords are not engaged. Z, my vocal cords are engaged. We have the difference between open and closed vowels. We have the difference between singular and plural words. So throughout language, there are all these oppositions. There's this, and that. And so structuralism is very much a system of oppositions. So then what happened was the typography that originally was just sort of imitating this natural handwriting becomes instead something that is really sort of based upon opposing parts of a letter. And so right now, if you think of what are the two different kind of types you could have serif and sans serif. So it either has little feet on the bottom or it doesn't have the little feet on the bottom. So there's a whole collection of oppositions that can be brought to bear on typography. Is it bold or is it unbolded? Is it italicized or is it unitalicized? So that notion of structuralism as being a system of opposition was very much in operation as it moved from a handmade, hand-carved representation of handwriting to a machine-created system of just opposition of parts. And so then the next page in the Canvas site points to someone who was mentioned in the law of the letters, this Zsuzsanna Lico. And so if you go to that page, what you'll see is this link to the firm that she and her husband started called Emigre Fonts. And if you look at that and then look at some of the samples, you will see just these wonderfully creative, imaginative font types that she and her husband have produced in their firm. But if you look at them, you can sort of understand how it is that the Macintosh computer and its ability to manipulate images in sort of untold numbers of ways helped her and her husband produce these wonderful fonts. But again, what they're doing is they're not imitating some natural kind of handwriting. They're taking a font and then they'll have it in a family and then they will manipulate it, and suddenly they've manipulated all the different ways you could manipulate a geometrical figure. And so it's a wonderful example of the creativity and the variety of visual effects and images that can be produced in font making, but basically on structuralist principles. So after the page on Zsuzsanna Lico and Emigre Fonts, then I'm going to talk a little bit about, you've received 2 different annotated videos on understanding Roland Barthes. And so because I understand how challenging he is, that's why I recorded the videos and then put the scripts with it. And now what I'm adding is I've taken my copy of that essay, which I mark up, and so then I scanned it and turned it into a PDF and posted it in there. And so you're going to see what it is I do is I'm attempting to understand a complex and sort of very sophisticated argument. And so it says, linked below you will find a PDF of my annotated copy of the article. I share it with you to give you a sense of the strategies I use when trying to understand a complex, densely written argument that relies heavily upon some rather technical terms. In this case, terms relating to both structuralist linguistics, about which I know a fair amount, and rhetoric, about which I know a lot, since that's what my doctorate is in. So I will probably provide one more video where I'm trying to basically take the final third of his essay and tell you what I believe his main points are. And I think that final third is the most difficult to parse and understand. And so what I'm going to do is try and give you my understanding of that section. Okay? And then we've got a couple more readings for next week. So the first one is a pretty recent article by a woman by the name of Laura Oswald, and it's called The Structural Semiotics Paradigm for Marketing Research, Theory, Methodology, and Case Analysis. Now, it's a 35-page article, but rather than have you read all of it, I'm letting you skip portions because some portions of the article you have already been exposed to in the first week when we talked about structural linguistics from Saussure or from Charles Sanders Peirce. And so you can skip, you could read them if you want, but you can skip those portions. But then what happens is she applies semiotics to a couple of sample marketing campaigns. And so particularly she's looking at McDonald's and Compaq Computer. And so that's the main point that I want you to get out of that article is how all this theoretical stuff about language basically can be applied to the image or the argument or the brand that someone is trying to communicate. And then the other reading is actually going back to a very early Harvard Business Review. It's something that Laura Oswald mentioned. She mentioned Sidney Levy for having identified the implications of semiotics for brand value in a seminal article in the Harvard Business Review, Signs for Sale. The correct name of the title is actually Symbols for Sale, and so I have a link to that. So then this is going back to the 1950s, and when you read this, it's not a very long article. It'd be interesting because if you look at the clip art in it, you say, wow, this does not look anything like a current Harvard Business Review article. It is, again, evidence of sort of the change of the way academic texts look now, some 60 or 70 years after this article. But one of the things that Levy is arguing for is how symbols work in branding, brand management, advertising appeals to an audience. So those are the things that we'll be doing this week. So again, I look forward to getting into your impossible, believable, aspirational self-portraits. I noticed that several of you, like me, aspire to some sort of athletic prowess. I think that's a wonderful thing to aspire to. Andrew aspires to having an awesome crib that would be on MTV Cribs. And who am I to say that that is not a worthy aspiration? I often wish I had a much nicer house than the one that I actually have. So I will be giving you one more video plus script about the final third of Barth's Rhetoric of the Image. I'll be giving responses to your impossible, believable, aspirational self-images, and then I will come up with a quiz to one or the other of the readings for this week. And once I've figured out which one I want to quiz you on, I will post that quiz in Canvas. And that's all I've got to say at this point. And I look forward to, if anybody wants to get in touch with me, give me an email, drop me a line, come by, visit me in the office. And so that's all I have for now. Talk to you later.